not going to be one of the actual 10 Commandments, but something that they're having a little fun with. So I read it, thou shalt not, and I couldn't read the rest of it right away, but it also appeared down there was a reference. So I looked again as it was a little closer, and I got a full view, and the shirt that said this, thou shalt not try me. Aha. I don't recall reading those in Exodus, right? That one. Maybe good advice, but not one of the 10 Commandments. So then I was curious, reference, well, what reference? And the reference underneath said, mood 24/7. Some people can be difficult to deal with, right? And I don't know about this individual, but I would guess that perhaps they're a little difficult to deal with. And or maybe somebody gave them that shirt, give them a hint. I don't know. I didn't ask. It was one of those that I saw from a distance, didn't talk to the person, but saw this. But it can be difficult to deal with some people. It's just part of it, part of life. Another reality is that sometimes it's difficult to deal with people in your own family. And you don't have to immediately agree to that, okay, especially if you have family members around you. But as the saying goes, you can pick your friends, but not your family. We're stuck with them, we might say. And we might joke at that sometimes, but sometimes there's more to it than that. To some degree, it amazes me that there can be such turmoil within a family. You might think, well, they're family, they should get along. But we all know that that is not always the case. As a matter of fact, family challenges are nothing new. And so if you have some within your family, it's nothing new. We only have to go one generation from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel that we had some intense turmoil between those two brothers. And we can read of that in Genesis as one brother would kill another. And it happens in our world today as well. Here's a story. This happened out in California about 10 years ago. There was a man that killed his brother, shot his sister, and then turned the gun on himself during a dispute over a family inheritance. The sheriff's office said that a man by the name of Robert, who was 55 years old, and his siblings had a meeting. They got into an argument over their mother's home. During the argument, Robert shot and killed his brother, who was 61, and then shot his sister. At some point, he turned the gun on himself and killed himself. He did not kill the sister, fortunately, and she was able to escape before getting help, and police were able to then intervene. And so we understand that within family situations, there can be challenges. And we read here from Genesis 37 that there were challenges there as well. But then you think this, okay, so from a world where people are not Christians, they do not have Christ in their life, we think, okay, maybe we can get it there because they don't have the Holy Spirit convicting them, they don't have the truth, so we can understand that. But what about the sons of the patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this family, we talked a little bit about that last week. Wouldn't they do what's right? But that's not the case, as we will see here today. Last week we talked about Joseph's background and his family and that rough situation there. Today we're going to see more of that. Last week we ended by noting that he was favored by dad and hated by his brothers, which sets up the scene for today. So I've entitled the message for today, Getting Rid of Joseph. Getting Rid of Joseph. Likely a familiar story to many of you. We'll recount it and we'll learn together as we go through it here. Pastor Matt led us in reading from beginning in verse number 5, and what we see here at the beginning of this is Joseph's dreams. Joseph's dreams. And he had 2 dreams, and he relayed them to his brothers. Maybe the question that you've thought about, I've thought about, is, maybe Joseph should have just kept his mouth shut and not shared these dreams. Some would claim Joseph was unwise, maybe even wrong for sharing this. I would actually disagree with this. I'm not saying that Joseph should have purposefully flaunted these dreams, but by them sharing this, it was the catalyst for what the brothers would do. It was at least part of why the brothers would sell him, and all of God's plan would unfold. Now, they meant it for evil, but God was going to use even this for good. So there's two dreams. The first dream was agricultural, as was read. Sheaves or grain that was bound. And those sheaves, as it says, would bow down to Joseph's sheaves, or sheave there, as he relayed this, the grain that was bound. You can see a little hint in that if you know the story of what would happen in Egypt. Grain was going to become a big part of the story eventually. The second dream was celestial. And they maybe thought in terms of the fact that the celestial bodies would have represented rulers in that day. And so for him to say all of these made obeisance or worshipped or bowed down towards him, it would have greatly angered and upset the brothers. So the dreams anger the brothers, but it also brings the rebuke of his father Jacob, as we read. However, as we read in verse number 11 there earlier, he would keep it in mind. Jacob did remember this. Now, he rebuked his son over this, but he did remember it. So let's move on here in this story. I'm not spending a lot of time there as we work through this today, but notice next in verses 12 and following, Joseph's instructions. And these are really the instructions that were given to Joseph, is what we're saying here. Verse number 12, and his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said unto Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, here am I. And he said to him, go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out to the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, they are departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. So Joseph is given instructions by dad. You need to go out and you need to find your brothers. Now, I want to remind you that Joseph is a young man at this time. He is probably in the range of 17 years old. And he is sent out to find the brethren. So he goes, he's obedient, by the way, he heads out. This was about a 50-mile journey that he went on. It was several days' travel for this young man. Understand that the sons would have been gone for lengthy times as they would do their job, and so he was to go get a report. Joseph traveled 50 miles only to find out they had traveled further, so he had to go an additional 15 miles. And again, we think in terms in our American culture of 50 miles and 15 miles as not that big of a deal. But for them, remember, he was not traveling in an air-conditioned vehicle. He didn't have the latest farm truck or anything like that. He was traveling on foot with animals, and so it was a much different culture there. So frankly, I'm amazed how he would travel 65 miles to be able to find them. I mean, you think about it today, if we get separated in Walmart with our family members, we go into panic mode, right? And we have to get out our cell phones. When we went on our trip down to visit my in-laws, we made a stop at maybe you've heard of these, I wanted to go there. It's called Buc-ee's, these big gas stations, and I wanted to go there. So we drove a little out of the way just to go there. And it was packed. So I dropped my entire family off and sent them into the Buc-ee's and said, I'll find a parking place, and came in. And my wife got in there, and she said, boy, I don't know if he's even going to be able to come in. I will call him. And she realized she didn't have her cell phone. It was with me in the car. At which point my kids were thinking, what in the world are we going to do? We'll never find Dad again. And my wife wisely and calmly said, it's okay. We used to do this. We can figure this out, We actually lived in the age before cell phones. And so good news, I did find a parking place and went in, and I found them. So we didn't get separated. We all came home, all right? But in that day, it was totally different. He didn't have GPS coordinates for them. He didn't have any way to find them in that way. He just relied on the words of others. So now Joseph is within the eyesight of his brethren, and he's heading over towards his brethren. Think of this. The brothers are looking. They see Joseph coming. And next we have for today a conspiracy. A conspiracy. Notice in verses 18 and following. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. Behold, they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. Joseph is walking towards his brethren, and there the brothers have a little family meeting. Not a friendly meeting. During this meeting, they conspire together, and they say this in verse number 20, come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will come of his dreams. Now, when these brothers say these things, you remember last week I told you the story in regards to Dinah, who was defiled. And the brothers didn't take kindly to that. As a matter of fact, as I reminded you last week, they would go in and deceitfully do this, but they would kill the men there. So these were not guys that just talked about this. They actually followed through with this. So they come up with a plan to kill him. They also follow that up with a cover-up, right? Because they know we can't just go home and tell Dad, yeah, we didn't like Joseph, so we just took him out. They had to come up with a plan. And remember, these brothers that are coming up with this plan are the men that the 12 tribes of Israel are going to be named after. It just boggles my mind in all of this. Their intentions are evil. Well, let's see what happens. Verse 21, one of the brothers steps up, and Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and he said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver them to his father again. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Reuben steps in all of this. For the brothers to even consider the murder of their brother indicates the powerful hate they had for Joseph. It was partly due to the favoritism that didn't help from Dad. He had that robe on there. They, of course, took that off of him because they didn't care for that. They still were wrong in their actions, though, to jump to this conclusion. And what we see here is that Reuben steps in, and Reuben appears to be the way that his life is going to be saved. In a sense it will, but not exactly how he plans it. So notice this all. Joseph's plan is to visit his brothers, get news, take it to his dad. That is Jacob's plan as well. Go find your brothers, bring me back word. The brothers minus Reuben also have a plan. Their plan is to kill Joseph and tell Dad it was an animal. Reuben has a plan. His plan is to throw him in the pit. And as we read there, he later wants to come back, get Joseph, get him out of there, rescue him, and bring him back to Dad and save him. But none of those plans were God's plan. God had a whole different plan. So, a question just to think about, were Joseph's brothers doing God's will? Oof, right? That's a tough question. Now, the key to answer that is that there is a difference between what God wills to come to pass and what God wants, we could say, or his desires from his children. So we could say, no, they were not doing God's will because what they were trying to do was absolutely in violation with what God would have commanded, right? It was clearly wrong. But we can say yes at the same time, because even despite their sinful actions, God had a plan and God was bringing something together. So you might think Joseph's mistreatment, being sinned against, was part of God's plan. Yes. It wasn't right. You know, sometimes people think, well, I need to get God off the hook for that. Because, well, God couldn't have ever had any part in any of that. But you know, when you hear the whole story, and some of you already know this, God is absolutely happy to be on the hook for it, so to speak, because it was all part of his plan. Follow it through. In the end, who gets the glory for all of this? The Lord does. But if you try to take God out of the circumstance, we try to pull God out of it, then who gets the glory? So what ends up happening here is that when Joseph arrives, it was a very cold welcome, right? He got the cold shoulder, we could say. His brothers take his robe. They throw him into this pit, as Reuben had suggested. The brothers, I believe, were content to just leave him there to die. They would have been happy to just leave him there to die. Well, Reuben planned to rescue him. Verse 25. They sat down to eat bread. Isn't that amazing? They could eat bread knowing their brother is now in a pit. And they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brethren and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let us not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. So the plan changes. We have a better idea now. Let's not kill him. Instead, let's sell him. And so while they are eating and they see this, God's plan is unfolding. Right? It wasn't their original plan, but now God's plan is unfolding. And the Ishmaelites come. They are descendants of Abraham through Hagar, and they concoct this new plan. Now, apparently, Reuben is not here at this moment. He has stepped away. Probably he's upset at what has happened. Perhaps he is actually trying to concoct his own plan of how he's going to get him out of there and take him home. And for 20 pieces of silver, they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. For them, it is a way that now they can say, we didn't hurt him, his blood isn't on our hands, but it still accomplishes, at least in their mind, their purpose of getting rid of Joseph. We won't have to deal with him anymore. By the way, Deuteronomy 24, verse 7 tells us that selling another man of Israel is punishable by death. Now, I realize that law came later, but I just want you to understand how serious God would look at this. Verse 28. Then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew up and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Joseph is pulled out of that pit. I can't imagine how the brothers could have looked at their brother Joseph. They must have seen the fear in his eyes. He was young. It just had to be so cold-hearted that they could take him and sell him and watch him taken off. I don't know how they could even hold those 20 pieces of silver in their hands. And the only explanation is their powerful hatred for him. Now put yourself in Joseph's shoes for just a moment. Here you are, you're just trying to do what Dad has said. You're just trying to go out, bring back word. The brothers didn't give you a warm welcome. Instead, they were quite awful to you. Here you are now being led away, perhaps tied up in some way to make sure he couldn't run off. And he arrives in Egypt. And there, at this point, he knows no one. He would have every right, humanly speaking, to be angry or feel betrayed with his own family and even with the Lord. God, why would you allow this to happen? Now, we'll come back to Joseph and how he handled all of that, but let's go back to the brothers here and notice next a cover-up in verses 29 and following. Verse 29, and Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes, and he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? So apparently Reuben had stepped away. He now comes back. Again, maybe he had come back thinking about how he was going to reason with his brothers and talk his brothers out of this and just explain to them this was a bad idea. We don't know exactly what was going on. Maybe he just went to check on Joseph just to make sure he's all right, but he comes to the pit and he's gone. Now, the cover-up. Verse 31, and they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it, and said, It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. Now they kind of circle back to their original plan here. Now they were going to kill him and do this. They instead sold him and now do this. They kill a goat. They dip the robe of his many colors in that blood. And they take it off to their father. Jacob immediately recognizes the coat and comes to the conclusion that the brothers wanted. Joseph has been torn by a wild animal. Do you remember what Rebekah put on Jacob to deceive Isaac? Goat skin, so he was hairy. And now Jacob is deceived by the blood of a goat. The deceiver has been deceived. Verse 34, and Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his son and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Jacob goes into mourning. Verse 36, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Dad is mourning and weeping. I hope the brothers had some sleepless nights. I hope they had some conviction on their minds. And I don't say that in a sense that I'm trying to be mean-spirited towards them. I say that in a sense that I hoped they felt the weight of what they had done. And in Egypt, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an officer there of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. And Joseph is now a servant in a new country with new people, completely cut off from his family. And we're going to end there for this morning, and we will continue the story next week. But I want you to see the power of hatred and deception. We are called upon as believers to love one another, not to live this way. I just encourage, if you were honest with yourself, would you say, I actually harbor within my heart some hatred towards somebody else, some anger so hard that I'm even willing to do awful things to them? If that is so, I hope that you would confess that, because that hatred, that anger can drive you to do terrible, awful things. But I want you to understand something else as we go through this story. And you have to see this overall picture in all of this, is that despite the wrongs and sinful actions of others, God's plans are not thwarted. God is ruling and reigning, and in this circumstance, we can see it so clearly when we look at the whole thing. But if you put yourself in Joseph's shoes right now as he's there in that house, he doesn't know how this is all going to end. He doesn't know the end of the story. Most of us are familiar with this, and we know the end of the story, so it's a really neat story for us. It's an exciting story. But we know the end, but Joseph didn't know the end. And you know what? Sometimes we're in the middle of the story. Sometimes we're in the middle and we don't understand what God is doing, and to us it doesn't make sense. We don't understand why God would do it this way, yet we have to have a powerful trust in our God to know that He is ruling, He is reigning, He is on the throne, and even though we can't see our way out of it right now, God knows. God is on the throne. So often when we get in those situations, our response is not a good response. Sometimes it's sinful, sometimes it's frustration. It's what can be many different responses. Sometimes we just throw our hands in the air, so to speak, and say, I just don't get it. But yet, God is on the throne, and He can be trusted, even in the difficult circumstance that you're going through, just like where Joseph is at this very moment. Let's bow our head in prayer this morning. Before I pray, I just ask you to search your heart. Would you say, if you're honest, and look, I have some anger, I have